We're ready.
Yeah. Start now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. First, I just wanted to mention, uh, as always, the first year in year, I dedicate in memory of Frank Borg, Ephraim ben, in his memory, Ephraim ben Moshe was a very, very close friend of mine. He davened in the shul. He was very helpful to me and to the shul. Died at a young age. And he's somebody that we're constantly remembering. That he died actually was it was Hey Year, his yahrzeit, and when the day comes by, I know it's Yom Haatzmaut, but there's always that memory of running to the emergency room, hearing about Frank having had a heart attack, and after waiting there for a short while, hearing the unfortunate news that he passed away, and he's somebody that we constantly miss. Okay, uh, this week is Yom Haatzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. Um, I'm going to discuss in the. I just want to discuss because, and I'm not so much that I want to discuss history as it'll come out later, but I want to discuss actually current events. But I'll start off with with focusing a little bit on history. Now, I remember as a young boy, I was born after the state of Israel, shortly after the state of Israel was established, and I used to read these Torah journals uh, every around Yom Haatzmaut, beginning of year, the Torah journals that would come out, each one with its own philosophy. They had the Hamor, which at that time was fiercely anti-Zionist, anti just about everything else as well. So and they would constantly write articles. Today, people don't waste their time so much on this, but in those days, these were big issues. So they would write articles why it's usher to celebrate, to have holidays. And they did not limit it to the philosophical issues of being pro-Zionist and not pro-Zionist, but they would discuss about having establishing holidays now in view of the fact that we'll get into it, the Butler McGillis. So, and on the other hand, I would see papers that suggest that you have to have the davening of Yom Haatzmaut with just every. It included like all the holidays. You had the L'chadot, parts of L'chadoti, things that were somewhat overboard. Uh, and it seems that in approaching this article, the question of whether it's proper to establish a holiday and not to establish a holiday, everybody was motivated not by the halachic issues, but they were motivated by their political or philosophical or hashkafa perspective, but they discussed it in terms of the halachic issues. But that wasn't the motivation. So people were at both extremes, and it was very rare to see that at times there was a rational discussion on the Shiloh. I'm not going to discuss any halacha l'maisa here. Listen, everybody has their own practice. They can do what they want. I'm not trying to convince people what side to take. But I think it's important to look back from the perspective of today and not just from the perspective of those years, the early years of the state of Israel. Now, there is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah discusses the question of Batla Megillas Tainus or Lo Batla Megillas Tainus. What does that mean? Every time there was an event that took place, a miraculous event, sometimes the events were one of survival, of military, of a military encounter, and the Jewish people in the Second Commonwealth surviving the military encounter, or somehow getting rid of enemies that were trying to destroy the Jewish people, trying to destroy the people, the Jewish people from living in Eretz Yisrael. Sometimes it was Greeks, sometimes it was Romans. No shortage of people throughout the history who had tried to make trouble for the Jewish people. And sometimes it was spiritual fights over spiritual questions between the Baisusim, those who rejected the Torah Shebaal Peh, for example, and the Chachamim, and with the questions of the Sfiras HaOmer, when do we celebrate Shavuos? Spiritual questions, and when the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people were victorious, they used to establish a holiday, and the holiday wasn't just on that particular year, but the Chachamim would establish a holiday to be observed every year on that particular day. Now, what was the manifestations of those holidays? Well, Hanukkah and Purim, we know how Hanukkah and Purim was celebrated. But the other holidays were not done in such the same manner as Hanukkah and Purim. Basically, you weren't allowed to fast, and you weren't allowed to give hespedim, depending on the day, a eulogy, because it was a happy day. My understanding of the holiday was that there was a mitzvah kiyumis in being happy. It wasn't an obligation. I could be wrong. It wasn't an obligation of being happy, but it was a voluntary mitzvah of being happy because of the event that had taken place on that day years before. But it was prohibited from doing something that will prevent happiness, like giving a eulogy. Giving a eulogy is something that invokes sorrow, invokes crying. So that's a negation of happiness. So on these holidays, you were not allowed to do certain acts that would negate the ability to be happy over the events that took place. That's just my own understanding of it. But after the Churban took place, after the Beis Hamikdash, and there were many, many holidays, and all these holidays were recorded in a separate book. It was called Megillas Tainus. And at that time, when the Megillas Tainus was initially being formulated, being written, it seems that it was not all written at one time, but at that time, the Torah Shebaal Peh, even the Mishnah was not yet put into writing. And this was perhaps the first of the Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral tradition that was put into writing. And while these holidays were celebrated, when the Churban took place, when the destruction took place, there seems to have been a dispute, an argument among the Tanoim whether these holidays that, let's say, commemorate victories that they might have had individual victories that they might have had against particular Greek generals. I'm not talking about Hanukkah, but ongoing during the war. So whether these holidays, in a sense, remained relevant or didn't remain relevant. So whether these holidays were to be observed after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, after the Jewish people went into Roman exile, and the conclusion of the Gemara is that, with the exception of Hanukkah and Purim, all these holidays cease to be relevant after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. To a certain degree, they lost their meaning, and perhaps we could suggest that they felt it would take away from the sorrow over the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. There are a number of possible ways to understand it. And then the question is raised in the Gemara about, what about new holidays? What about new holidays? There were events that took place after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash that were considered miraculous, and it was a salvation for the Jewish people. And the question was whether new holidays could be established. An example given, the Gemara, there are two examples, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, but on Daf Yutes, it starts on Yudches, but Daf Yutes, so it was on it was a special holiday on the 28th of Adar, which obviously we don't celebrate today. So that they got good news that they would not have to remove themselves from Torah. I saw that some say Torah study. I think the simple reading of it is, even though the word orais is used, from Torah observance and Torah study. Shegazra Malchus Gzeira. Malchus means Rome. That the Roman government made a decree. Shelo yasku b'Torah. They shouldn't study Torah. B'shelo yomulu es b'neihem. And they should not be allowed to circumcise their children. B'sheyichalulu shabbosos. And they made a decree that the Jews had to be mechal Shabbos, not observe the Shabbos. Masa Yehuda ben Shamua v'chaveira. So what did Yehuda ben Shamua do? Holchu v'notlu eitzam mitronisa achas. They took advice from a noble woman who had apparently had access to information, and she was part of the royalty or the family of the governing body. And they asked them, what should we do? She apparently had a good relationship with the Jewish people, and they explained to her the situation. And by the way, here it's important. From this Gemara, we see how important it is to have connections with people who have a positive attitude towards the Jewish people. I think today, many Jews fail to understand what Yehuda ben Shamua b'Chaverov understood at that time. And by cultivating that relationship, having that relationship, they were able to bring a salvation to the Jewish people. But if we turn against people who offer the Jewish people help and thereby give support to those who, for whatever their intentions are, work against the Jews, and sometimes, unfortunately, those who work against the Jews are sometimes, unfortunately, biologically Jews themselves. So, and so they asked, what should we do? How can we stop this? It's so important for us to continue Torah, to continue Jewish observance. And she understood that. Amr Lehem, she says, Bo'u v'havginu balayla. Go out and cry out in public protest at the nighttime. Why at the nighttime? In other words, do it in a quiet manner. Don't do it like a demonstration of power where it's not necessary. But appeal to the sensitivity of some of the people there. Bo v'havkinu b'layla. Holchu v'hivkinu b'layla. At night they did things quietly. V'hivkinu b'layla. Amru, Ei Shemayim. For heaven's sake, Lo achechem anachnu. Aren't we your brothers? We want to have a good relationship with you, because Rome was descendants of Esav. V'lo b'nei Av echad anachnu. Aren't we all descendants of Avram and Yitzchak? V'lo b'nei Eim achas anachnu. And are we not the descendants of Rivka? Manishtana mikoluma v'lashon. You invaded so many countries. You took control of so many countries. Why are you mistreating us more so than all the other countries? That you make all kinds of terrible decrees against us. And they were successful. So, that day, the 28th of Adar, when they heard that they were successful, it's interesting. It doesn't say the day that the action was taken, but the day of the celebration, the day that they heard about it, they made into a holiday, and they made that as a holiday for every year. It seems, it's interesting, it's a side point, but it seems that the celebration of every year was made in a manner to join the celebration that the Jews had in that year. Otherwise, you would have assumed that they would have made that the celebration when once they found out the date that the decree was changed, but that the Gemara emphasizes they made the yearly holiday on the day they got the news. The Isal Kadaitach, and if you and that was after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, "V'isal kadaitach batla megillas tainis." If you say that as a result of the korban, of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Jewish people going into exile, so all these holidays were abrogated. So is it possible to suggest that the old holidays became non-valid anymore? The old holidays were pushed aside, and new holidays were established. Obviously not. If the old holidays were pushed aside, they obviously, because of the tragedy, they obviously did not make any new holidays. So, Kamaisa Batal Achrainaisa Mosifin, would they add new holidays? Obviously, they wouldn't add new holidays. So you see from the Gemara here that the Gemara here assumed, at least, so the Gemara here assumed that we do not establish new holidays, and this was the shita of the Pri Chadash. The Pri Chadash's opinion was that today we are not allowed to establish new holidays. However, the opinion of the Maharam al-Ashker, and this was the opinion of the Magen Avraham, and this was the opinion of the Chassam Sofer, what the opinion of all these authorities was that you are allowed to establish new holidays. So there is an argument, there's a dispute whether today, after the Churban, one is allowed to establish new holidays or one is not allowed to establish new holidays. And this Gemara in Rosh Hashanah is the Gemara that the Pri Chadash uses as proof against the opinion of the Maharam al-Ashker. The Maharam al-Ashker opinion was that we could establish, when we have new events that take place, new events of salvation, we can establish new holidays. And the opinion of the Pri Chadash is that you can't establish new holidays. Now, I found it somewhat interesting that most of the groups that were against establishing new holidays, and they used to bring this Gemara as proof of it, they had their own holidays. When they had an event, let's say when their rebellion were saved during World War II, so they established a holiday. But you could say that holiday was only established for a small group, not for all of the Jewish people, whatever it is. But I want to answer the question, though, that the Pri Chadash asked against the Maharam al-Ashker. In other words, you see, the Gemara says, if they abolished all the old holidays, they certainly did not add any new holidays. So it seems, as the Pri Chadash says, that today we're not allowed to establish new holidays. And I have a number of answers to the question. I want to mention two of the answers. And then, assuming that the Pri Chadash's reading of the Gemara is correct, so we can ask a question. So the Gemara here is telling us that you're not allowed to establish new holidays today. After the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So if that's the case, why doesn't the Rambam mention it? And this question is asked by others. Why doesn't the Rambam mention it, that one is not allowed to establish new holidays? It's a halacha, a way the Pri Chadash reads the Gemara. It's a halacha that's mentioned in the Gemara. So why doesn't the Rambam mention that one is not allowed to establish new holidays today? So I think I just want to suggest 2 or 3 answers now. One answer, and this answer would remove the question that we asked against the Rambam also. One answer is, the Gemara doesn't mean to say you're not allowed to establish new holidays. The Gemara is talking about the Chachamim at that period of time. And at that period of time, the Chachamim, the sages at that time, abolished the old holidays because of the Churban. But why did they abolish the holidays? Because the holidays perhaps lost their meaning. So the Gemara is asking if they felt in their evaluation of that period of time that these holidays, because of the oppression that the Jewish people went through after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, after the Jewish people went into exile, that these holidays lost their meaning. So would they, understanding the feelings of the people, they felt that it's not likely that they felt that this is the proper time to establish new holidays. Obviously, we do not have the power of the Chachamim of those days. So even if these old holidays, which I do not think became more relevant today, we couldn't reestablish them as required holidays anyway, because we don't have the authority that the sages at that time had. But they abolished the old holidays because of their evaluation of what the attitude of the people at that time was. So that's what the Gemara says. If they felt there was a need to abolish the old holidays, they certainly felt that the attitude, the nature, the depression of the people will, because of the depression of the people, because of the situation they were encountering, we should not establish new holidays. So but there is no halacha contained here. But I think, and this is one answer that we give, I think there is another possible answer we can give, and I think both answers might be correct. The Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, in discussing the holiday of Chanukah, so Chanukah, I mentioned in Purim, was an exception. The Gemara discusses why it's an exception, but the Chanukah and Purim remained holidays even after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. But the Gemara discusses what was the holiday. The Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Megillah and Chanukah says, "B'vay Sheni Kishamolchu Yavan," when the Greeks ruled over Israel. Gazul Gzeras al Yisrael, they made decrees against the Jewish people, and they did not allow them to be involved in Torah learning or to do mitzvos. And they took their money, and they used the daughters of the Jewish people for their own purposes, and they entered the Beis HaMikdash, and they did all kinds of terrible things, and they were very oppressive to the Jewish people until God had mercy upon them, and the Chashmonaim, or the Kohanim, the Chashmonaim, Vahargum, they gathered an army together, and they went out against the Romans, and ultimately, V'hamidu Melech min HaKohanim, the Jewish people were victorious. There was a salvation for the Jewish people, both on a religious level and on a mundane level. Also, the Rambam emphasizes, V'hamidu Melech min HaKohanim. They appointed a king from the Kohanim. There is a discussion why from the Kohanim. B'chazra Malchus LiYisrael, and rulership over Israel was returned to the Jewish people, because previously it was the Greeks who ruled over Israel. Yeser al Masayim Shana ad Churban Hasheni, until the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. So we have to ask a question. I think, why did the Rambam have to put in? Now, many point out, now during those, because one of the big issues that came up with the establishment of the State of Israel is because most of the leaders at the time of the establishment of the State of Israel were certainly not religiously oriented. Many were anti-religious, and there were those that felt that actually, from a religious perspective, the establishment of the state of Israel could not be seen in a positive light. But for this Rambam, it seems to be that the reverse is apparent, because it's true. Many now, because the Rambam says it's not just that they had for one generation or two generations a Jewish king, but he says for 200 years they had Jewish kings, Jewish rulers, until the Churban, until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So control over Israel was returned to the Jewish people. And we know some of those leaders were very oppressive on a religious level. But apparently they understood that as oppressive as they were, had there been, the rulers at that time had been non-Jews, the oppression would have been much greater. So the Rambam explains that, but the question is, we're celebrating a historical event. Why is it important for the Rambam to emphasize that Jewish kingship returned for 200 years? He should say, and they appointed a Jewish king, and the government became Jewish again, was no longer under Greek rule. Why does he emphasize that it continued for 200 years? So I think that there are two types of miracles that we celebrate. One is historical, an event that happened in the past. In other words, we had a victory. There was a salvation for the Jewish people. And we celebrate what happened in the past. But there are times when the impact of the victory, not just the impact, but to a certain degree, the miracle itself, the salvation and the miracle continue. So there are two types of miracles that we celebrate. And I want to suggest that perhaps we could say that that's what the Rambam wants to point out. The Rambam wants to point out that until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, Hanukkah wasn't just celebrated because of what happened in the Chafei Kislev of that year, that the Jewish people took control of the Beis Hamikdash, that the Jewish people took control of Eretz Yisrael, that the Jewish people ruled over themselves and stopped the Greek oppression against them. It wasn't just the historical event, but it was the historical event was perpetuated, continued. It had an impact, and more than an impact, the miracle continued throughout the duration of the Second Commonwealth. And I'm wondering if we could suggest that now every miracle has a lasting impact, but there are degrees in the lasting impact. So I want to now, Hanukkah, of course, the control of the Jewish people, government control of the Jewish people at the time of the Churban, the Romans took over. They lost that control. So the Gemara asked the question, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? And the Gemara gives an answer, because Pesumei Nisan was a special reason. But it seems up till that point, up till the time of the Churban, according to the Rambam, we could suggest that in addition to celebrating the historical event, the historical salvation that took place, the ongoing impact was reason to celebrate. In other words, it wasn't just a celebration of the past. It was a celebration of the present. Every year they were celebrating, every year they were celebrating the fact that the Jews were retaining control up till the Churban. That the Jews were retaining control over Eretz Yisrael, over their own lives. And I'm wondering, this is a thought that I just thought of this morning, that perhaps when the celebration is not just identified as the celebration of a historical event, but the event is perpetuated. The miracle is perpetuated. Salvation is perpetuated in a major manner. And control over Eretz Yisrael is a major manner. So then we're not just celebrating because of the past event, but we're celebrating because of the ongoing salvation, the ongoing miracle. And the other events in Megillas Taanis, it took place, and there was some impact, but the celebration focused not just on mainly on the historical event, rather than the ongoing impact. And now, so that perhaps could be another reason. So when the Gemara says that they celebrated because the celebration was in that historical event, it's true. They continued to observe Torah and mitzvahs, but in other words, once the historical event took place, they didn't need any additional miracles. But the miracle itself, the victory they got, focused just on that event. Now, and really, I think it's worthwhile to look at the establishment of the State of Israel, not just from the perspective of the historical event, but to look at the establishment of the State of Israel, looking back, seeing all what has taken place throughout the years, how the Jewish people have been able to survive. We're not celebrating what happened in 1948. We perhaps have to give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the fact that the Jewish people have survived and continue to survive. Look at all the yeshivas that they are in Eretz Yisrael. I know the fight about being drafted into the army or not. That's for another time. Do you think that if the Arabs had been in control of what they call Palestine, that all these yeshivas would exist? I know I've read how people say, oh, the only reason the Arabs are opposed to the Jews is because the Zionists fought against them. We see the Arab countries fight one another. The Arab families in a particular area constantly, even today, last week, in certain cities in Israel, there was fighting between one Arab clan and another Arab clan. Can you really believe today, after seeing how they're fighting with each other? One of the biggest miracles I think that we had was that Iran, instead of focusing their fight against Israel, decided to attack other Arab countries. Otherwise, all these countries would have run to their support. Okay, it might not be just this time, but it was extreme. Uh, Winston Churchill, I was told, considered one of the greatest miracles of World War II that Hitler, Yamach Shemo, decided to attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was his ally. And just out of the blue, he decided to attack them. And we had that same miracle. We had that same miracle now. And because we know that the Arab countries have a very strong influence. And the fact that they did not come out against Israel helped the Israeli cause. Now, so the miracles, so both on a religious level, and on a don't view it just from the perspective of 1948. Not that things were so great then, because to a certain degree, the establishment of the state of Israel for the Jew is the end of World War II. Where did the Jews go after World War II? Who was willing to take them in? They were in DP camps. So it was ongoing. It was ongoing. So I think the establishment of the state of Israel, and I remember the Jewish people have had ongoing wars, and unfortunately, that situation, perhaps hopefully to a lesser degree, will continue. But we have miracles every day. Israel can't afford to lose even one war. And it's miraculous that they have never lost a war. Now, if you take a look, I want to explain this this idea a little further with something that my father said. My father used to repeat it very often on Yom Kippur. To him, it was an important message. At the end of Parshas Haatzmaut, we have the Parsha of Arayos, the prohibited marital relationships, the prohibited incest, adultery. In a sense, the Parsha of Arayos at the end of Parshas Haatzmaut talks about some of the most severe averos, the most severe sins of the Torah. And immediately after that, the Torah talks about Dusha, about holiness, holiness. Doshim tiyu, biskadishtem b'yisam doshim. And Dusha represents the highest rung on the ladder of perfection, my father would say. So we go from the depth of immorality to the highest rung of sanctity. It seems that the whole Torah could have separated the two parshios. That's the question my father used to ask, and he would repeat it very often on Yom Kippurim. Haatzmaut, the end of Haatzmaut is the Kriyat, the Mincha of Yom Kippur. So now, and my father would say that a person, the only protection a person has from falling to the lowest is by aiming for the highest. Do not think I want to be an average. No, you have to aim for perfection. Everybody's perfection could be different. Each person has a different mission in life. And you might not even reach that state. That might, in all likelihood. No one reaches the state of perfection. But perfection has to be our goal. By making ourselves Kodesh, by aiming for Dusha, we become Kodesh. We become holy. And so, as a matter of fact, I once at a dinner, Moshe David Tendler, son-in-law of Moshe Feinstein, he was speaking, and he expressed the same thought. He said, do not. It's not good enough to aim, to have your goal, at to be an average American. Many parents, when they enroll their children in school for education, what is their goal? Especially nowadays, I want him to be an average American. So he said, the average American doesn't exist. He says the average American has 1.9 legs. So it doesn't exist. Our only protection, it was the same thought that my father expressed. The only protection we have is when we aim for perfection. And now it's interesting, and I've discussed this in the past. When we take a look at these psukim, how do we aim for perfection? How is it possible to aim for perfection? What are the criteria? To be an average American, we pretty much know what the criteria are, even though they change from day to day. Look what an average American was 10 years ago. And today, the standards are much lower. And the contrary, they will say that the immorality, the wokenism, that's the highest standard, they'll say today. So, but how do we aim for Dusha? And I think we could explain it with something I've said time and time again. You take a look at the Goshen, the beginning of Goshen. Daber Shem Moshe Lemor, Daber El Kol Adas B'nei Yisrael V'Martlem Goshen Tiyu. Be holy. Why? Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elkeichem. And so you have to make yourself holy. What's the first mitzvah mentioned in the Torah when it talks, after talking about the requirement to make ourselves holy? Ish imo v'aviv tiro. Have fear. Fear not in the sense of being scared of, but fear, awe, respect for mother and father. It seems now Dusha is something that's uniquely Jewish. I always mention the story that my father told me. My father told me, he said, during World War II, the big hero, unwarranted, of course, of the Jewish people, after all, the opposition to Hitler, Yamach Shemo, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At that time, perhaps not everybody knew about how Roosevelt was not sensitive to the oppression of the Jewish people, the murder of the Jewish people in Europe. And maybe because we Jewish people felt safe in the United States, and he was the president of the United States. But when he died, all over the country, in the Jewish community, there was mourning. There was mourning. He was the savior of the world, and the savior, some felt, of the Jewish people as well. Of course, today we know differently. And Hespedim, eulogies were given, probably had to be given. I'm not sure every place that they had one really wanted to give the eulogy, but whatever it was, they had eulogies in all the places, in all the synagogues, in many of some of the yeshivos as well. And my father mentioned he was at one of these eulogies for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and in fact, at that time, because he was the outstanding personality, they asked, it was everything. It was in Yiddish. They asked for Moshe Feinstein to say a few words, and Moshe Feinstein, my father told me, said very nicely. He didn't overpraise Roosevelt at all. He says that what the halacha requires us to show respect to the government, because if not for the government, each person would be swallowing up the other one, as we see in recent years when the government doesn't intervene. And he says, but especially today, when nations are swallowed, that was World War II, nations are swallowing up nations, we certainly have to show respect. That was the hesped that Moshe Feinstein gave, very appropriate for the situation at that time. But then it seems that perhaps the Democratic Party was playing a role in that hesped, so they got a chazan to make a kel mole. And Rav Michal Feinstein, who was the nephew of Moshe Feinstein, a great Gaon in his own right, he later became the son-in-law of the Brisker Rav. He went over to the person making the kel mole, and he said, when you make the kel mole, do not say b'malos gdoshin. He says, we have Chasidei Umas Olam. We have the pious of the nations of the world. But holiness is something that, from a halachic perspective, is something that is uniquely Jewish. You can't say b'malos gdoshin. You can say b'malos chassidus. You can say all that, even though today we can question a lot of that also in regard to Roosevelt. But not doshim, not holiness. So it's very odd. On one hand, the Torah tells us, doshim tiyu, be holy, which is uniquely Jewish. And then the Torah tells us, ish imo ba'aviv tiro, a person has to show regard, respect, awe for his mother and his father. Now, awe for mother and father, that's not a uniquely Jewish attribute. Matter of fact, the Gemara tells us that we can learn from non-Jews how to show proper respect to parents. So why is it that after Doshim Tiyu, the first mitzvah, you would have thought that the mitzvah would be something that is identified uniquely with Jews. Matter of fact, I don't know that the answer is a great answer, but one of the Achronim, a guy named I don't mean anything against the Achron that says it. Why don't we make a bracha on kibbut avim? Okay, to be honest with you, I don't know. Wait, when are you going to say make a bracha every time you serve them a piece of cake or what? Okay, but whatever. Why don't we make a bracha on kibbut avim? Said because we say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvosa b'tzibanu. Bracha talks about things that are uniquely Jewish, sanctified us. By Kibbur Aveim, we find Kibbur Aveim that the non-Jews understand that also, and they sometimes are examples. And this is a question, I have a number of answers, but one answer that I've mentioned is based on something that happened when my uncle, the Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveichik Zatzal, was sitting Shiva for his wife in Boston. We were there, of course, for the Levaya. It was Tainis Esther, and then we were there Sunday, also the first day of Shiva, but later on, then we went back to Chicago, and later I met somebody that was there, Yosef Blau, who happened to be there throughout the Shiva, or at least on days that after we had left. And he told us that Rav Hutner, Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, who had in the early days was very close with our family, was my father's Rabbi for a period of time, and my father considered him a Rebbe for the rest of his life, rest of my father's life. Of course, my father's main Rebbe was my grandfather. So he came to Menachem Ovel, my uncle. And that time, somebody raised the question, why is it that for a spouse, a wife or a husband, the halacha is that Avelus is only 30 days. But for a parent, the Avelus, the mourning period, is a whole year, in limited fashion, but a whole year. Why is it that way? And Rav Hutner, everybody made a suggestion, but Rav Hutner suggested that the reason was, I understand that he had many rayas. I wasn't there. I couldn't tell you the whole thought that he expressed, but he said because the parent is the linkage that the Jew has to Matan Torah. The yichus, not yichus in the vain sense as it's used today, but in the linkage to Matan Torah, the connection to Matan Torah. And I would say, even further than that, in a certain respect, certainly to Matan Torah and to the Avos, the Klal Yisrael, the parent is the linkage. Someone who goes through Geirus, so we know that they're considered, they're like descendants of Avraham Avinu. But so it's the parent is the linkage to of the generations, and this is the concept of Mesora. This is the concept of Mesora, and it's our Mesora to Matan Torah. We have to look back at the previous generations to understand what Dusha is. If we don't look back to future generations, if it's not based on Mesora, then our goal is to be the average American. And especially there is no such thing as the average American, but usually people don't even meet their goal. So I think, Doshin Tiyu, how do we have Dusha? Yes, we can learn proper respect to parents, but that a non-Jew has. But to the Jew, it's much more than respect. It's much more than just Hakaras Hatov, which is all true. Showing appreciation, it's all true. But to the Jew, it's the linkage to the former generations, to the giving of the Torah, to our ancestors. That's where Dusha, emanates from. If we want to know how to lead for the Jew, it's only when we look to the past that we can be sure we won't fall to the lowest. Look what's happening today in the woke generation. And understand that the woke generation is the generation, and the Jews who join these woke movements are among the Jews that fight the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. The only protection we have, is to be a linkage to the former generations. This is the problem. Why is it that so many Jews are now coming out against the Jews in Eretz Yisrael? And they joined the Sonei Yisrael, the contemporary Nazis. Why is it that way? But the answer is there's a new perspective of Mesora, and this stretches generations also. The old perspective of Mesora is from the past to the present. We receive attitudes from our past generations. The Torah, the experiences of the past generations are our guide. But we find now, even among some of the observant, that there's a new Mesora. The new Mesora starts from the youngest generation going backwards. Parents who are children or grandchildren of the victims of the concentration camps somehow now talk against Israel. Why? Because their Mesora that they had from the past generations, and many of them had that Mesora, the direction has changed. It changes from there. It changed. Their Mesora now begins with their children on the college campuses. The children who don't have pride in being Jewish. The children that to them being the average American is more important than being a good Jew. And this is Yom Haatzmaut. That represents the uniqueness of the Jewish people. It gives the Jewish people having their own land, gives us an ability on a national level to maintain the tradition of our ancestors. And we have to, on Yom Haatzmaut, yes, we have to protest on behalf of Israel. We have to do everything we can to help our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. But at the same time, we have to remember that can only be accomplished if our attitude to the Mesora is the Mesora that begins with Matan Torah and with Avram Avinu, with the Avos. But if the Mesora begins with the children who are on the college campuses, who have the woke attitude, then it will only lead to us dedicating ourselves not to Dusha, but we'll say to be an American, but it'll be to Tumah as opposed to Dusha. We have to dedicate ourselves to Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is a holy land. The Jewish people are a holy people, and we as individuals have to fulfill the commandment of Doshim Tiyu, and the first step will be Ishimo Va'aviv Tiro.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. There's nothing in here yet.
Okay.